Malcolm Ellis, a successful black surgeon and CEO, faces systemic racism and prejudice as he fights to expand healthcare access for marginalized communities in his small town. Despite his accomplishments, he is repeatedly undermined by city officials and law enforcement, particularly by Officer Daniels and City Councilman Greg Hayes, who dismiss his achievements based on racial biases. Malcolm must navigate subtle microaggressions, veiled insults, and overt discrimination as he challenges the deeply entrenched system that seeks to invalidate his success and keep him in a subordinate position. The stakes rise as he confronts these forces head-on. The old diner had seen better days. The Formica countertops, once shining with a fresh coat of polish, now looked worn and scratched, the kind of wear that comes with years of late-night diners, spilled coffee, and hard memories. The neon sign outside flickered intermittently. Harold's Cafe, serving the best breakfast in town. A slogan that probably hadn't been true for years, but still pulled in a steady stream of locals. Malcolm Ellis walked through the door at exactly 7:15 a.m., and just as the sun started to stretch its pale fingers over the city. His black suit, custom-tailored and sharp, contrasted sharply with the casual, faded atmosphere of the diner. The bell above the door jingled, but no one looked up. To them, it was just another customer. Another person blending into the anonymity of the morning rush. He was used to this. The heavy weight of his position as a surgeon, the CEO of one of the most successful medical organizations in the state, always seemed to fade into the background when he was here. In this place, the thick glass windows framed the quiet, humble streets of Elmsford, a small town that hadn't changed much in the last 30 years. It was the kind of town where everyone knew your business, or thought they did, and where the weight of who you were often didn't matter unless you were one of them. "Morning, Malcolm," Harold greeted him with a smile, his voice rough but warm. Harold, the owner of the cafe, had known Malcolm since the days when Malcolm had been just another high school student, trying to figure out his way in a world that seemed to already have its mind made up about him. "Morning, Harold," Malcolm replied, his voice steady but carrying the undertone of familiarity. He slid into a booth near the back, the one where he always sat. It gave him a good view of the room, though there wasn't much to see in the early hours of the morning, except for a few regulars who barely lifted their heads as they sipped their coffee. A waitress, young and friendly, shuffled over to his table. She was a bit out of place in her oversized apron, her long braids swishing as she moved quickly to take his order. Her name tag read, Jasmine, and she smiled when she saw him. But it was a practiced smile, the kind that said she didn't really know him, but had seen him enough to know his routine. "The usual, Dr. Ellis?" Jasmine asked, her tone polite, but not overly eager. She knew him as Dr. Ellis, as most people did, but in this diner, it almost felt like a distant memory. Here, he was just a man with a name, and that name was far less important than the mug of black coffee he had ordered every single day for the past 5 years. Malcolm nodded, slipping off his suit jacket and hanging it neatly on the back of the chair. He always took his jacket off here. It was a habit, a small rebellion against the sharp, crisp expectations of his other life, the one that made him stand taller, look more put together, and constantly move with a sense of urgency. Here, in this space, there was time. Time to just be Malcolm. "Make it extra hot today, Jasmine," he said with a smile, his deep voice carrying a subtle warmth that betrayed the weight he carried each day. "Got it," Jasmine replied with a quick nod, her eyes flickering down for a moment, almost as if checking the time before she rushed off. Malcolm watched her disappear into the kitchen, and for a second, he let his gaze drift to the window, the glow of the sun breaking through the clouds. It was one of those mornings that seemed to belong to no one in particular, neither here nor there, just another cycle of mundane routines carrying everyone through their day. But for Malcolm, it was everything. The simplicity of the moment, the quiet hum of the diner, the clink of dishes in the back, it allowed him to breathe. It was a relief. He had built his life up from nothing, climbing his way through a system that often felt as if it was built to break him. As a black man in a position of power, he had faced more resistance than anyone should ever have to endure. There had been moments where his qualifications had been questioned, his decisions second-guessed, and his leadership mocked. Not in obvious, overt ways, those had been easy to fight off, but in the subtle, everyday indignities, The slight hesitation when he walked into a room, the whispers behind his back, the glance that lingered just a second too long, as if trying to figure out what a man like him was doing, in a space that wasn't supposed to be his. Malcolm was aware of all of this, but he had learned over the years to fight it with the quiet power of his position. The business world had been a battleground, but he had emerged victorious, not because of any special treatment, but because of sheer will. It wasn't always easy, but it was necessary. Yet, when he walked into this diner, this humble, unassuming place, none of that mattered. He wasn't Dr. Malcolm Ellis, CEO of Ellis Health Systems, a man who was revered by his colleagues and feared by his competitors. He wasn't the man whose reputation had been built on years of hard work and sacrifice. No, here, in Harold's Cafe, he was just Malcolm. The same Malcolm who had walked these streets with dreams bigger than his world allowed. The same Malcolm who had fought to rise above the noise, to earn a seat at tables that hadn't been made for people like him. Here, no one cared about his titles, his bank account, or his accomplishments. Here he was just another man, ordering his coffee, but there was something in that anonymity that made it all worthwhile. The sound of the door chimed again, and Malcolm's thoughts were broken by the entrance of a man he didn't recognize. The newcomer was tall, with sharp features and an air of purpose that Malcolm knew all too well. He wore an expensive suit, though it wasn't nearly as sharp as Malcolm's. His shoes clicked against the tile floor with confidence as he walked up to the counter. Harold greeted him with a nod, but there was a moment's hesitation in his voice, like the man was somehow out of place here. Jasmine returned with his coffee, setting it gently on the table in front of him. As she turned to leave, her eyes flickered to the newcomer at the counter, and for a split second, Malcolm saw the subtle shift in her expression. It was a glance, an involuntary one, but it was enough to tell him everything he needed to know. There was something about the man that commanded attention. A presence. He wasn't just a stranger in a suit, he was a challenge. Malcolm didn't turn his head to look. He knew better. The dynamic in the room had shifted, and he could feel it. There was a time when he would have allowed himself to get swept up in the power plays, the dominance games. But he had learned, the hard way, that in the spaces where everyone was scrambling for attention, where titles and wealth defined your worth, true power was in the silence. It was in moments like this, when you could choose not to engage, when you could rise above. He sipped his coffee, letting the warmth fill him as the quiet hum of the diner enveloped him again. But in the corner of his eye, he noticed the newcomer glance his way. The man's gaze lingered for a moment, assessing, calculating, before he quickly shifted his attention back to Harold, who was now setting a mug in front of him. There was something in the air, something that told Malcolm that this morning would be different. His phone buzzed in his pocket, a gentle vibration that only he could feel. Malcolm pulled it out, glancing at the screen. It was an email from his assistant at Ellis Health Systems, confirming a meeting that was scheduled later that day. The subject was marked, urgent. He sighed, his hand tightening slightly around the phone. The world he lived in, the world he had fought so hard to build, was always waiting, always demanding something from him. And while the diner and its unassuming atmosphere offered him a moment of peace, he knew it wouldn't last long. He would soon be forced to return to the fray, where he would have to be the man everyone expected him to be, the man who commanded attention. For now, though, Malcolm allowed himself to enjoy the calm, the steady drip of coffee into his cup, the soft chatter of Harold's regulars, the brief moments when he could simply be. The hum of the cafe became a little louder as more people filed in for their morning routines. But in the corner of his mind, Malcolm couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, that something was just around the corner, something that might challenge everything he had worked so hard for. The man at the counter. Malcolm didn't know him yet, but he would. And when they finally met, Malcolm knew that this meeting would be one of the few moments in his life when his titles, his wealth, and his reputation might not be enough to protect him. Malcolm Ellis couldn't shake the feeling that the quiet morning he had hoped for was slowly slipping through his fingers. He wasn't one to believe in omens or superstitions, but something about the way the atmosphere in Harold's Cafe had shifted, subtle, yet unmistakable, kept his mind running on a loop. The air was heavier now, filled with a sort of unspoken tension. As he took another sip of coffee, The quiet of the diner seemed to close in on him, leaving him with only his thoughts and the steady drip of the coffee machine in the background. The stranger at the counter, the one with the expensive suit and commanding presence, had yet to leave. Instead, he seemed to linger, talking with Harold in low, hurried tones. Malcolm didn't think much of it at first. Maybe the man was just another businessman passing through, the kind of person who didn't care for the charm of small-town diners, but only came for the quick breakfast before heading back to the city. But the way he looked at Malcolm earlier, just a little too long, with a tilt of the head, as if sizing him up, made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He tried to focus on his coffee, ignoring the subtle undercurrent of unease bubbling up inside him. It wasn't that he hadn't faced this before. He had the looks, the murmurs behind his back, the assumptions that came with his skin, and the wrong assumptions about his place in the world. But it was different when it was this close, when it was this personal. Harold's voice broke through his thoughts, and Malcolm looked up to find the man at the counter walking over to his table. The stranger was smiling, but there was something tight about it, something rehearsed. "Dr. Ellis, I presume?" the man asked, his voice dripping with a forced politeness. "I'm Robert Lancaster. We haven't had the pleasure yet, but I've heard a lot about you." Malcolm felt his body stiffen slightly, his internal defenses rising. Lancaster's smile didn't quite reach his eyes. The man's posture was all wrong, too stiff, like he had just been handed a role he wasn't quite comfortable with. But it was the way his eyes moved, lingering on Malcolm's face and down his body, that made his stomach tighten. It wasn't just that he didn't recognize Malcolm's face. It was the way he looked through him, as if he were seeing the outer layer, the suit, and not the man underneath it. Malcolm stood, offering a handshake that Lancaster hesitated for just a beat too long before accepting. The handshake was firm, but it carried a weight that only someone who had learned to protect themselves from the bias of others could truly understand. "Pleasure to meet you, Mr. Lancaster," Malcolm said, his voice calm but sharp. He felt the tiny surge of irritation bubbling just beneath the surface, but he forced it down, reminding himself of the ground he had fought so hard to gain. Lancaster took a moment to size him up once again. "I've heard your hospital's doing great things in the community. Expanding, I believe?" His tone was flat, businesslike, as if he was trying to make small talk while also assessing Malcolm's worth, his value, like a commodity on display. "Yes," Malcolm replied, his voice unwavering. "We're always looking for ways to improve, to expand our reach and impact." Lancaster's lips twitched, as if he was trying to keep his words measured. "I see," he said slowly. "That's good, very impressive, I must say. But I've always believed that real leadership, true success, is about more than just the numbers. Wouldn't you agree?" There it was, that subtle jab, barely veiled, the implication that perhaps, just perhaps, a black man couldn't truly have earned his success, not without some outside help, some untold story hidden beneath the polished facade. Malcolm could feel his patience fraying at the edges. "I agree," Malcolm said with a calm smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Leadership is about people, about the care we give, not just the results on paper." Lancaster's smile faltered, just for a moment. He looked at Malcolm again, his eyes scanning him from head to toe, lingering a little too long on the black suit, the finely polished shoes, the way Malcolm's calm demeanor filled the space with an undeniable presence. "Of course," Lancaster said, the words now more clipped than before. He nodded, as if satisfied with the response. "I was just making an observation, of course." It was all too familiar. The careful dance of words, where the underlying message wasn't a question of success or achievement, but a question of how Malcolm had heard this same line of questioning before, always veiled in politeness, always couched in subtle insinuation. He had spent years building his reputation, crafting his path in a world that wasn't always ready for a man like him. But no matter how successful he became, there were always moments like this, when the skin of his success peeled away and revealed the truth. People saw what they expected to see, not who he was. Lancaster moved to the counter to settle his tab, and Malcolm sat back down, his jaw tight. He was no stranger to this kind of subtle racism. The small gestures, the pauses, the looks. It was a familiar weight that followed him everywhere, even into spaces where his success had earned him respect. He felt a cold anger stir within him, anger at the way people like Lancaster assumed they could treat him like a second-class citizen, despite his years of hard work, his achievements, his worth. But that anger had to stay buried. Malcolm knew it. It always had to stay buried. If he reacted, if he allowed his emotions to show, it would be another reason for them to dismiss him, another reason for his authority to be questioned. "Everything okay?" Harold's voice cut through his thoughts. Malcolm looked up to find the older man watching him with a mix of concern and curiosity. Harold wasn't a stranger to the ways the world treated Malcolm, but even so, there was a part of Harold's old-school worldview that still couldn't quite see the weight Malcolm carried every day. "Fine," Malcolm said, forcing the tension out of his voice. "Just another day." Harold gave him a long, knowing look before turning back to his other customers. Malcolm wasn't so sure if "fine" was the right word, but it was the one he'd use in public. He had no choice. The rest of his meal passed in relative silence, but as the clock ticked closer to the time when Malcolm would leave for his meeting, a new figure entered the diner. He was tall, wearing a jacket that seemed just a little too shiny for the quiet, country atmosphere of Harold's cafe. His hair was neatly combed, his face sharp, his demeanor almost too polished. He slid into a seat 2 booths down from Malcolm, making a loud enough scene for it to be obvious that he wasn't just a casual diner. He was someone important. The man glanced around, his eyes sweeping across the room, until they landed on Malcolm. His gaze lingered just a little too long, and when their eyes met, he didn't look away right away. There was something almost deliberate about it. Malcolm tried to ignore the glance he'd been in this position before, when people saw the suit, the title, the education, and the immediate assumption was that they deserved to be treated with more respect. But Malcolm also knew how easy it was for them to flip that assumption on its head, to treat him like a stranger in his own city. The man cleared his throat, his eyes still lingering on Malcolm. He made a slow, deliberate move to stand up, as if weighing whether to approach. "You're Dr. Ellis, right?" the man asked, his tone casual, but edged with an undercurrent of something else. It wasn't admiration, it wasn't curiosity, it was something else. Something that made Malcolm's skin itch. "Yes, that's right," Malcolm replied, trying his best to keep his voice steady, to hide the immediate tension that had begun to rise in his chest. "And you are?" "Ah, right," the man said, flashing a tight smile. "My name's Roger Duvall. I'm with the city council. We've been looking into some of the healthcare issues around here. I think we should sit down and have a discussion soon, but you're a busy man, I'm sure." "Of course," Malcolm replied, keeping his voice level. He had a suspicion of where this conversation was headed. The kind of discussion Duvall was likely referring to was the kind where his authority was overlooked, his hard-won respect dismissed. In this town, it was the quiet but unspoken way things were done. It wasn't just about healthcare, or even his hospital, it was about control, and people like Duvall didn't want people like Malcolm to have any. The smile that spread across Duvall's face didn't reach his eyes. Instead, it felt as if Malcolm had just become another box to check off. Malcolm knew this was a test, and he also knew the rules. Keep calm. Don't react. Let the tension build, and let them reveal their hand first. The heat of the day settled in, pressing down on the streets of Elmsford, making everything feel just a little more suffocating. Malcolm Ellis had been on edge all morning, and by the time he walked out of Harold's cafe, the feeling had only intensified. His meeting at Ellis Health Systems was still a few hours away, and yet, the sense of foreboding that had crept up on him in the diner remained. The weight of the stares from people like Roger Duvall and Lancaster, the subtle dismissal of his accomplishments, clung to him like a second skin. He had faced discrimination before. Heck, he had been fighting it since his earliest days in medical school. But something about the undercurrent of this small town felt different. It was quieter, more insidious. There was no outright hatred here. It wasn't that obvious. It was all the little things. The sideways glances, the too long pauses in conversations, the assumptions that he didn't belong in places he had earned his right to be. As Malcolm walked down the sidewalk toward his car, his phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a text from his assistant, Julia, confirming the time for the meeting and reminding him about the recent expansion of the hospital's services into the neighboring district. The usual day-to-day reminders that should have been comforting, but instead, they felt like just another layer of the pressure piling on top of him. He knew what this was. The calm before the storm. He didn't know it yet, but that storm was coming faster than he could have imagined. At precisely 1 p.m., a Malcolm pulled into the parking lot of the city courthouse, the building looming ahead like a fortress. It was old, weathered by time and the hands of countless decisions, but it still held a certain power over the people who walked through its doors. This was where laws were made, where judgments were passed down, where the system that Malcolm had spent his life working within could either break or elevate him. Today, he wasn't just here to discuss hospital business. Today, he was here to meet with city council members about expanding health coverage to marginalized communities, something he had fought for tirelessly. But as he stepped out of the car, he could feel it. The tension in the air, thick with expectation and uncertainty. It wasn't just the meeting that had his stomach turning. It was the quiet recognition that today might be the day when he would truly face the system's prejudice, when his entire career could hang in the balance. Inside the courthouse, the usual buzz of paperwork and hushed conversations filled the air. Malcolm made his way down the hallway toward the conference room where the meeting was scheduled. As he walked, he passed a few officers, their uniforms stiff and crisp, their postures rigid. He didn't know them personally, but he had seen them around town. In the past, he would have nodded a quick greeting, aware of the careful balancing act required when interacting with law enforcement, always making sure to be respectful and polite, even when it was clear that the system they represented wasn't always kind to him. But today, as he walked through the hall, something was different. One officer, Officer Daniels, was standing by the door, chatting with a colleague. The man's eyes flickered toward Malcolm as he approached, and for a brief moment, the officer's posture stiffened, as if something about Malcolm's presence triggered a response in him. It wasn't hostility, not outright, but it was something more subtle, a resistance, a question that lingered in the air. "Morning, Dr. Ellis," Daniel said with a polite nod, but his voice was flat, mechanical. There was no warmth, no respect in it, just an acknowledgement of authority. "Morning, Officer Daniels," Malcolm replied, his voice smooth, careful. He made a conscious effort to keep his tone neutral, to avoid the flicker of tension he felt rising in his chest. He could see Daniels trying to play it cool, but the look in his eyes told a different story. It was as if Malcolm's very presence in the courthouse, an educated, wealthy black man, was something Daniels hadn't quite processed yet. Without another word, Malcolm moved past Daniels, but not without feeling the weight of the officer's stare on his back. The air seemed heavier with each step he took. There was something brewing here, something Malcolm couldn't quite put his finger on, but he knew it was coming. When Malcolm entered the conference room, the familiar faces of the city council members and hospital administrators greeted him with perfunctory smiles. But the tension in the room was undeniable. The issues at hand were important, vital even, but the undertones of the discussion were impossible to ignore. It was as if, the more Malcolm spoke about the need for change, the more the room shrank, as if his very words were threatening the status quo. As he laid out the hospital's expansion plan, his voice firm and clear, he could feel eyes on him, eyes that weren't listening to the content of his proposal, but were instead focused on the fact that he was black, that he was a man of power and influence in a system that hadn't been made for men like him. One of the council members, a man named Greg Hayes, leaned forward in his seat, his fingers steepled in front of him. Hayes had always been a skeptic, one who favored the status quo, and he made no secret of his doubts about Malcolm's leadership. "I'm just wondering," Hayes said, his voice cold and calculated. "If this expansion is truly the best use of our resources, you're asking us to invest in underserved communities, sure, but what's in it for the rest of the district? What's the ROI, Dr. Ellis?" Malcolm's jaw tightened. This wasn't about returns. This wasn't about profits. This was about people, about giving families access to the health care they deserved, no matter their income, their background, or the color of their skin. But he knew better than to give in to the anger building inside of him. "The return," Malcolm said, his voice smooth, measured, "is in the lives we save, the families we help, and the community we build. I'm not here to talk about numbers, I'm here to talk about the future of this town." The room grew quiet, the silence thick with unspoken judgments. Malcolm's words hung in the air, but no one seemed to acknowledge them. Not in the way they should, instead. Their eyes flickered over him as if he were nothing more than a shadow in a well-lit room, someone they could dismiss with a wave of the hand. Greg Hayes, who had been staring intently at Malcolm, suddenly leaned back in his chair, his tone dripping with condescension. "You know, Dr. Ellis," Hayes began, his words slow and deliberate, "it's impressive how far you've come. Truly from nothing to something. But we have to wonder, do you truly understand the complexities of managing something like this? The financials, the logistics? I'm not sure a man like you has the kind of perspective we need here." Malcolm's fists clenched under the table. "A man like you." There it was. The assumption that he was out of place, that his success was somehow an anomaly, something that didn't belong in this room. His mind raced, but he kept his face neutral, even as his heart began to pound. This was no longer about healthcare. This was about respect, about the right to be seen for who he truly was, not just the labels people tried to impose on him. "I assure you, I understand," Malcolm said, his voice tight but controlled. "I've spent my entire career making sure I understand, and I've built a system that works. The question is, do you?" The room was still. The weight of his words hung in the air, but it didn't last long. Hayes waved it off, dismissing him as if his argument didn't matter. And then, as if to further compound the insult, another council member, a woman named Linda Hart, spoke up. "You know, Dr. Ellis, we've worked with people like you before," she said, her voice thin and brittle. "People who want to change the system. But we can't just hand you a district because you say it's what's best. You've got to prove it. The people of Elmsford want action, not just rhetoric." Malcolm could feel the heat rising in his chest, but he swallowed it down. This wasn't the time. He needed to play their game. He needed to show them that he was better than this. "I've spent years proving myself," Malcolm said, his voice calm, but carrying an edge that he knew couldn't be ignored. "And I'll continue to prove it, but not for you, for the people who need it, for the ones who don't have a voice." The room erupted into murmurs, and just as quickly, Malcolm stood up, his chair scraping against the floor. The energy in the room shifted, and he could feel it. The challenge, the line being drawn. "I'm done here," he said, his voice hard and final. "I've given you everything you need, the rest is up to you, but don't think for a second that I'm walking away from this." As he turned to leave, he felt their eyes on him again. This time, however, he didn't care. This time, the system had pushed too far. The meeting wasn't over, but for Malcolm, it was. The tension Malcolm had felt earlier now exploded into full force, and as he stormed out of the room, the future of his mission hung by a thread. The weight of the prejudice he had endured, the systemic forces that sought to undermine his work, had reached their peak. What would happen next? Would he be able to salvage the situation? Or would he be forced to confront them in a way that changed everything? With each step, the stakes were only rising higher. He was about to face the choice of how far he was willing to push. How much was he willing to sacrifice to challenge a system that was designed to break him? Malcolm Ellis stood in the hallway of the courthouse, the hum of muffled conversations in the distance barely registering in his mind. He could feel the pressure building inside him, the knot in his chest tightening with each passing moment. He had tried. He had given them everything, his expertise, his time, his heart. And still, it wasn't enough. Still, they treated him like an outsider, like someone who didn't belong in the room, despite everything he had achieved. His grip tightened on the door handle as he prepared to exit the room. But before he could turn the knob, a voice called out to him. "Dr. Ellis, I need to speak with you." Malcolm paused. He recognized the voice. Greg Hayes, the city councilman, whose insinuations had felt like a slap in the face. Hayes had been a thorn in Malcolm's side for years, but he had always managed to maintain composure. Now, as the tension in the room reached its peak, Malcolm couldn't hold back the frustration that surged within him. He turned slowly, meeting Hayes's gaze. The man stood in the doorway, arms crossed, the tightness in his posture signaling that whatever he had to say wasn't going to be pleasant. "I don't have much time," Malcolm said, his voice calm but edged with irritation. "If this is about the expansion plan, we're done. I've said what I need to say. If you're not willing to listen, then that's your problem, not mine." Hayes didn't flinch at the words. Instead, he took a step forward, lowering his voice so only Malcolm could hear. "You know, Hayes said, his tone taking on a condescending edge. "There are some people in this town who don't trust a man like you making decisions for their families. You've come a long way, Dr. Ellis, but you can't forget that people still see you as the outsider, no matter how many suits you wear or how many degrees you have hanging on your wall." The words hit Malcolm like a punch to the gut. He had heard this before, but never from someone so close to the decision-making process. This wasn't just a comment on his achievements, it was an attack on his very presence in the room. An attack on the fact that he, a black man, had risen to the heights he had. Malcolm's mind raced, but he kept his expression steady. He wasn't going to give Hayes the satisfaction of seeing him lose control. Not today, not now. "I've worked my whole life to earn this seat," Malcolm said through gritted teeth. "And I won't apologize for that. If you can't accept that, then maybe it's time you reconsider your position." Hayes's eyes flickered with something that could have been resentment or annoyance. It was hard to tell. But before he could respond, Officer Daniels appeared at the end of the hallway. The moment he stepped into view, the tension in the air thickened, like a storm cloud gathering just over Malcolm's head. Daniels had been a shadow in Malcolm's life for years, another face in the crowd, another figure who had never been particularly warm, but had always maintained a certain level of professionalism. Until now, there was something different in the way Daniels approached him. His gait was more deliberate, his eyes narrowing as they met Malcolm's. "Dr. Ellis," Daniels said, his voice flat, almost mechanical. "I need to speak with you." Malcolm frowned. "Now I'm in the middle of something." "This is urgent," Daniels insisted. "It's about the hospital's records. We need you to come down to the precinct." Malcolm's heart skipped a beat. The words "come down to the precinct" weren't just a request, they were an order. And in that moment, he realized what was happening. This wasn't just a conversation. This wasn't just another subtle attempt to undermine him. This was a public humiliation in the making. A statement Daniels had been sent by the system, by people like Hayes, to remind Malcolm of his place. To show him that no matter how high he had climbed, there were still people who saw him as nothing more than a black man who needed to be put in his place. Malcolm's blood ran cold. He wasn't going to play their game. Not now. Not anymore. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. There was no time to waste. This was bigger than a personal affront. It was about the system that had always sought to break him, to make him smaller than he was. "I'm not going anywhere with you," Malcolm said, his voice firm. He could feel Hayes's presence behind him, and he knew that this was about to become a spectacle. "If you have an issue with my hospital's records, you know where to find me. I'm not answering any questions here." Daniels's eyes hardened. He stepped closer, his large frame towering over Malcolm. "You don't have a choice in the matter," Daniels growled. "You need to come with me." The silence in the hallway was deafening. Malcolm felt the eyes of everyone in the building upon him, and he knew that this moment would define everything. This was the confrontation he had been dreading, the one that would force him to choose between playing along with the system or standing his ground. "You're making a mistake," Malcolm said, his voice low but resolute. "This isn't about the hospital's records, this is about you trying to prove something, and I'm not going to let you do that." Daniels scoffed. "You think you can just talk your way out of this? I don't care who you are, Dr. Ellis, you're not above the law." Malcolm's heart pounded in his chest, but he refused to back down. He knew what Daniels was doing, trying to provoke him, trying to make him react in a way that could justify the arrest that was almost certainly coming. It was a game, but Malcolm wasn't going to play it. Not this time. "You're right," Malcolm said calmly, meeting Daniels' glare. "I'm not above the law, but neither are you." There was a beat of silence before Daniels took a step back, clearly trying to regain control of the situation. Hayes, standing just behind Malcolm, remained quiet. His eyes darting between the two men, sensing that the situation was spiraling out of his control. He had underestimated Malcolm's resolve. Now, he wasn't so sure what to do. "We'll see about that," Daniels muttered, before turning on his heel and storming down the hallway. Malcolm exhaled slowly, his body tense with adrenaline. He had just narrowly avoided the trap they had set for him. But this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. As Daniels disappeared around the corner, Malcolm stood there for a moment, letting the gravity of what had just happened sink in. He had been pushed, tested. And now, He knew exactly how far they were willing to go to bring him down. But he wasn't going to let them. Not without a fight. It was then that he heard a voice behind him, a quiet one, filled with uncertainty. "Malcolm?" He turned to see Mitchell, one of the few allies he had in the council, standing at the edge of the hallway. Mitchell's face was lined with concern, his posture tentative. "Mitchell," Malcolm said, his voice quieter than he intended. "I don't know how much longer I can take this. Every time I think I've made progress, something like this happens." Mitchell hesitated, looking at the ground before meeting Malcolm's eyes. "I'm sorry. You don't deserve this. No one does, but you have to understand. It's not just you. The system's built to push people like us down, to make us doubt ourselves, to make us believe that we don't belong in these spaces." Malcolm nodded, his fists still clenched. "I've been fighting this fight my entire life, Mitchell. I thought maybe it would get easier once I made it to the top, but it's like the higher I go, the harder they push." Mitchell stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You can't let them win, Malcolm. You can't. You've built something they can't tear down. But it's going to take everything you've got to stand your ground. Don't let them force you into their narrative. Stand firm." Malcolm's mind raced as he considered Mitchell's words. He wasn't going to let this go. He couldn't. The stakes were too high, and the cost of backing down was too great. "Thank you, Mitchell," Malcolm said, his voice low but steady. "I'll make them see me. I'll make them see all of us." As Mitchell walked away, Malcolm stood alone in the hallway, the weight of the world on his shoulders. He was ready for the next step, for the confrontation that would define not only his career, but the future of his fight for justice. But first, he had to survive what was coming next. The air in the courthouse had grown thick with tension as Malcolm stood in the hallway, heart pounding, hands clenched into fists at his sides. His earlier exchange with Officer Daniels had rattled him more than he cared to admit. It wasn't just the suddenness of the encounter, it was the realization that this wasn't merely about him anymore. This was about a system that would never accept him, no matter how far he had come. Daniels wasn't just doing his job. He was a part of something much bigger, a system that was designed to keep people like Malcolm in check. But Malcolm couldn't let that happen. He wouldn't. As he stood there, alone with his thoughts, a familiar figure appeared at the far end of the hall. It was Greg Hayes, the city councilman, whose thinly veiled disrespect had stoked the fire in Malcolm's chest. Hayes was flanked by two men, local businessmen who had long been aligned with the city's old guard. They walked toward Malcolm with purpose, their eyes locked onto him like sharks circling their prey. Malcolm's jaw tightened. He knew what was coming. He had been pushed to the limit, but now it was time to take a stand. "Dr. Ellis," Hayes said, his voice dripping with faux cordiality, "I think we need to have another conversation, a real conversation." Malcolm met his gaze, his posture straight, his voice steady. "I'm listening." Hayes glanced around, as if checking for any onlookers before leaning in slightly, his voice lowering just enough for only Malcolm to hear. "You really think you can change this town?" Hayes asked, his words more bitter than before. "The system is what it is. You don't just walk in here and think you can fix everything. It's not that simple. You'll never be accepted by the people who matter." The words were a blow, but Malcolm had braced himself for them. What stung more wasn't the insult, but the truth behind it. Hayes wasn't just speaking as a city councilman. He was speaking for a whole class of people. People who didn't want to see someone like Malcolm in a position of power. They didn't want to give up their control. Malcolm took a breath, focusing on the simmering rage that threatened to boil over. He could feel the anger rising, but he pushed it down, choosing his next words carefully. "I didn't come here to be accepted by people like you," Malcolm said, his voice calm but sharp. "I came here to make a difference. I came here to make sure that people, no matter where they come from, get the health care they deserve. That's something you'll never understand." Hayes sneered, his lip curling into a derisive smile. "You're out of your depth, Dr. Ellis, and we both know it. You think you're above this system, above the people who built it. You'll never have their respect, no matter how hard you try." Just as Malcolm opened his mouth to respond, a voice from behind him interrupted. "Enough." It was Officer Daniels. His towering figure filled the hallway, his expression unreadable as he stepped into the confrontation. but the tension in his posture was undeniable. Hayes glanced at Daniels, his eyes narrowing in surprise, but then he straightened up, as if expecting Daniels to back him up. "You think I'm going to stand by while you let a man like him tear down everything we've built here?" Hayes asked, his voice rising. "Do you really think this town wants someone like him calling the shots?" Daniels' gaze shifted to Malcolm. The silence between them stretched for a moment, and in that moment, everything seemed to shift. Daniels wasn't just the officer anymore. He was a pawn in a much bigger game, a game that Malcolm had played long enough to recognize Daniels was part of the machine, part of the system that kept men like him on the outside looking in. Malcolm straightened his back, locking eyes with Daniels. "You think you're doing the right thing?" he asked, his voice low but full of intent. "You think this is justice?" Daniels took a step forward, his face hardening. "Justice?" he scoffed. "Justice is making sure the people who belong here get what's theirs, not letting someone like you push your way in and destroy everything we've worked for." Malcolm's anger flared, but he kept his voice steady. "You don't get to decide who belongs here. I earned my place. I fought for everything I have, and if you think you're going to push me out because of the color of my skin, then you've underestimated me." Hayes laughed, a cruel, almost mocking sound. "You think you're the first one to think like that? You think you're special? Let me tell you something, Dr. Ellis. You might have fooled a few people, but not me. You're just a pawn in a game you don't even understand. And the people who really matter, they'll never let you have what you want." The words cut deeper than Malcolm wanted to admit. He had spent years building his reputation, fighting for his seat at the table. And here it was, his greatest enemy, not in the form of any individual, but of the system itself. A system that could not and would not accept him. Malcolm's resolve hardened. This wasn't just about winning a fight anymore. This was about taking a stand for everything he believed in. "Maybe you're right," Malcolm said, his voice firm. "Maybe the system does want to push me out, but I'm not going anywhere, and neither are the people I've sworn to protect." Daniels stepped closer, his hand instinctively resting on the holster of his gun. The threat wasn't subtle, but Malcolm didn't flinch. He stood his ground, meeting Daniels' gaze head-on. "You think you can intimidate me?" Malcolm asked, his voice cool, controlled. "You think that just because you wear a badge and carry a gun, that makes you right? You're wrong. You're nothing more than a cog in a broken system, and I'm done letting you push me around." For a moment, there was nothing but silence. The tension was so thick, it was almost suffocating, and Malcolm could feel the weight of the eyes on him, the council members, the staff, even the few bystanders in the hallway. This was it. This was the moment when everything could either fall apart or fall into place. Finally, Daniels took a step back, his lips curling into a tight smile. "You're playing a dangerous game, Dr. Ellis, and I'm warning you, you don't want to see how far I'm willing to go to stop you." Malcolm's heart raced, but he didn't let his composure slip. This wasn't just about him. This was about more than one man's ambition. This was about justice, about fighting for those who had been silenced for too long. "You don't scare me," Malcolm said, his voice low but fierce. "And you won't stop me. I'm not just fighting for myself. I'm fighting for the people who have been ignored, pushed aside, and left behind by people like you. And I won't back down." Hayes scoffed and turned on his heel, signaling to Daniels that it was time to leave. The two men walked away, their retreating footsteps echoing in the hallway. But as Malcolm stood there, watching them go, the feeling of victory was bittersweet. He had won this battle, but the war was far from over. Malcolm stood alone in the hallway, the weight of the confrontation still heavy in the air. He had held his ground, but as the minutes passed, the reality of what had just happened began to set in. This was more than a petty disagreement. It was a challenge to the very system that had shaped his entire life. And now, as he stood at the crossroads of his career, he knew he had a choice to make. What would he do next? Could he continue to fight the system and risk everything he had worked for? Or would he walk away, knowing that the fight had cost him too much? The decision hung in the balance, as uncertain as the future itself. The air in the courthouse had grown thick with tension as Malcolm stood in the hallway, heart pounding, hands clenched into fists at his sides. His earlier exchange with Officer Daniels had rattled him more than he cared to admit. It wasn't just the suddenness of the encounter, it was the realization that this wasn't merely about him anymore. This was about a system that would never accept him, no matter how far he had come. Daniels wasn't just doing his job. He was a part of something much bigger, a system that was designed to keep people like Malcolm in check. But Malcolm couldn't let that happen. He wouldn't. As he stood there, alone with his thoughts, a familiar figure appeared at the far end of the hall. It was Greg Hayes, the city councilman whose thinly veiled disrespect had stoked the fire in Malcolm's chest. Hayes was flanked by two men, local businessmen who had long been aligned with the city's old guard. They walked toward Malcolm with purpose, their eyes locked onto him like sharks circling their prey. Malcolm's jaw tightened. He knew what was coming. He had been pushed to the limit. But now, it was time to take a stand. "Dr. Ellis," Hayes said, his voice dripping with faux cordiality, "I think we need to have another conversation, a real conversation." Malcolm met his gaze, his posture straight, his voice steady. "I'm listening." Hayes glanced around, as if checking for any onlookers, before leaning in slightly, his voice lowering just enough for only Malcolm to hear. "You really think you can change this town?" Hayes asked, his words more bitter than before. "The system is what it is. You don't just walk in here and think you can fix everything. It's not that simple. You'll never be accepted by the people who matter." The words were a blow, but Malcolm had braced himself for them. What stung more wasn't the insult, but the truth behind it. Hayes wasn't just speaking as a city councilman. He was speaking for a whole class of people. People who didn't want to see someone like Malcolm in a position of power. They didn't want to give up their control. Malcolm took a breath, focusing on the simmering rage that threatened to boil over. He could feel the anger rising, but he pushed it down, choosing his next words carefully. "I didn't come here to be accepted by people like you," Malcolm said, his voice calm but sharp. "I came here to make a difference. I came here to make sure that people, no matter where they come from, get the healthcare they deserve. That's something you'll never understand." Hayes sneered, his lip curling into a derisive smile. "You're out of your depth, Dr. Ellis, and we both know it. You think you're above this system, above the people who built it. You'll never have their respect, no matter how hard you try." Just as Malcolm opened his mouth to respond, a voice from behind him interrupted. "Enough." It was Officer Daniels. His towering figure filled the hallway, his expression unreadable as he stepped into the confrontation. But the tension in his posture was undeniable. Hayes glanced at Daniels, his eyes narrowing in surprise. But then he straightened up, as if expecting Daniels to back him up. "You think I'm going to stand by while you let a man like him tear down everything we've built here?" Hayes asked, his voice rising. "Do you really think this town wants someone like him calling the shots?" Daniels's gaze shifted to Malcolm. The silence between them stretched for a moment, and in that moment, everything seemed to shift. Daniels wasn't just the officer anymore. He was a pawn in a much bigger game, a game that Malcolm had played long enough to recognize. Daniels was part of the machine, part of the system that kept men like him on the outside looking in. Malcolm straightened his back, locking eyes with Daniels. "You think you're doing the right thing?" he asked, his voice low but full of intent. "You think this is justice?" Daniels took a step forward, his face hardening. "Justice," he scoffed. "Justice is making sure the people who belong here get what's theirs, not letting someone like you push your way in and destroy everything we've worked for." Malcolm's anger flared, but he kept his voice steady. "You don't get to decide who belongs here. I earned my place. I've fought for everything I have, and if you think you're going to push me out because of the color of my skin, then you've underestimated me." Hayes laughed, a cruel, almost mocking sound. "You think you're the first one to think like that. You think you're special. Let me tell you something, Dr. Ellis. You might have fooled a few people, but not me. You're just a pawn in a game you don't even understand, and the people who really matter, they'll never let you have what you want." The words cut deeper than Malcolm wanted to admit. He had spent years building his reputation, fighting for his seat at the table, and here it was, his greatest enemy, not in the form of any individual, but of the system itself, a system that could not, and would not, accept him. Malcolm's resolve hardened. This wasn't just about winning a fight anymore. This was about taking a stand for everything he believed in. "Maybe you're right," Malcolm said, his voice firm. "Maybe the system does want to push me out, but I'm not going anywhere, and neither are the people I've sworn to protect." Daniels stepped closer, his hand instinctively resting on the holster of his gun. The threat wasn't subtle, but Malcolm didn't flinch. He stood his ground, meeting Daniels' gaze head-on. "You think you can intimidate me?" Malcolm asked, his voice cool, controlled. "You think that just because you wear a badge and carry a gun, that makes you right? You're wrong. You're nothing more than a cog in a broken system, and I'm done letting you push me around." For a moment, there was nothing but silence. The tension was so thick it was almost suffocating, and Malcolm could feel the weight of the eyes on him. The council members, the staff, even the few bystanders in the hallway. This was it. This was the moment when everything could either fall apart or fall into place. Finally, Daniels took a step back, his lips curling into a tight smile. "You're playing a dangerous game, Dr. Ellis, and I'm warning you, you don't want to see how far I'm willing to go to stop you." Malcolm's heart raced, but he didn't let his composure slip. This wasn't just about him. This was about more than one man's ambition. This was about justice, about fighting for those who had been silenced for too long. "You don't scare me," Malcolm said, his voice low but fierce. "And you won't stop me. I'm not just fighting for myself, I'm fighting for the people who have been ignored, pushed aside, and left behind by people like you, and I won't back down." Hayes scoffed and turned on his heel, signaling to Daniels that it was time to leave. The two men walked away, their retreating footsteps echoing in the hallway. But as Malcolm stood there, watching them go, the feeling of victory was bittersweet. He had won this battle, but the war was far from over. Malcolm stood alone in the hallway, the weight of the confrontation still heavy in the air. He had held his ground, but as the minutes passed, the reality of what had just happened began to set in. This was more than a petty disagreement. It was a challenge to the very system that had shaped his entire life. And now, as he stood at the crossroads of his career, he knew he had a choice to make. What would he do next? Could he continue to fight the system and risk everything he had worked for? Or would he walk away, knowing that the fight had cost him too much? The decision hung in the balance, as uncertain as the future itself.